Hello, everybody. Good evening. Good evening. I'm your host, Jed Applerouth. Happy to be here tonight with y'all. We're going to wait for about 30 or so seconds. We have people coming in the room. And as you enter the room, there may be a little poll here. It's just two questions. We're actually going to have two other small question things later on. But this one's an entry. Are you a parent, student, an educator? And if so, what grade are you in? Go ahead and fill that out. And that's all for now. So the room is still filling in. Give me a few more seconds here. We'll let folks get settled in, and then we'll jump into the content. Okay. All right. We're starting to hit a little plateau there. All right. Let me jump in. And so always with our webinars, you will be getting a video recording. We'll send you a link, and if you want to watch it later or share it, it'll be available to you, a durable link, and hopefully you'll get benefit and possibly want to share it with someone. And we're going to have Q&A also at the end. So definitely I'm going to go through some slides. I go through kind of a lot of information because there's a lot to cover. And then we'll have Q&A at the very end. So let's jump in. All right. So the frame, the high level, the world is predominantly test optional. There are 1,900 colleges that are test optional, but it doesn't mean that testing is not going to have an impact. And we know that the test required movement is growing every year. We're kind of getting back to where we were. At a previous time where a lot of the schools that are very selective and the state schools are now test required. The high level testing is dominated right now by the SAT, though the ACT is making a comeback. It is, it's trying to make some changes with a shorter test, making science optional. It's doing some things, trying to win over converts. But right now, 2/3 of our students are taking the SAT, and that's roughly about the same thing for the country. So the SAT is currently the dominant test in the US. Again, though you never know, it was the ACT a few years back, so things can shift, things can change. The colleges that are very selective, many of them are now back to being test required. And also we're seeing a steady return of the southern schools, especially the big flagships from Texas to Tennessee, to LSU, to the Georgia schools, Florida schools. They're all now test required. And we expect this trend to continue. Waiting for UNC, waiting for some other schools to fill in the South, and then, looking at UVA. But definitely things have been shifting back towards test required. On the calendars here, the most recent one was this month. We learned that Claremont McKenna, the McKenna schools out there, they are now test required, and I'm waiting to see if Harvey Mudd goes back. LSU was in February, and then before that, Alabama, Princeton, Auburn, Carnegie Mellon. So every year we're adding about 6, 7 schools, and they're often schools that are very selective, very desirable, and some of the big flagship schools. So expect the next one coming up in a couple months, and then over the summertime. That is now what it's more normalized. When you're curious about which schools might come back to testing, look to the percent of students they enroll who send test scores. And that gives you a sense, like UNC, 7 in 10 kids who are enrolled sent test scores. UVA, 6 in 10. Penn and Princeton were over 7, and now they are test required. Emory could go back as well. So we'll see what happens, but definitely that's one thing I look forward to try to figure out which schools may be considering a return to test requirements. The rationale, many of the schools, MIT, Brown, Yale, they're seeing that the SAT scores help them predict who will do well. And often they predict at a better clip than high school grades. I heard some stat today that I think it was out, UC, maybe in UCLA, but where they had 30,000 kids applying with 4.0 GPAs, which is, they have, I don't know how many spots they have, but they could fill their class 3 times over with kids with 4.0s. So there's been a lot of grade inflation. It's pretty troubling. And it's one of the reasons why we're seeing more focus back on testing when so many kids have these phenomenal GPAs, and gradings is different, where people feel like, giving a B could be taking away someone's chances in college admission. So we're giving a lot more A's in high school. because of game theory and its competitive dynamics, trying to advantage kids from their high schools in this game of grade inflation. This was some of the research that came out that shows that as test scores increase, GPA in college increases almost lockstep, but high school GPA is a much softer predictor of performance in college. And these were for the Ivies plus. This is for the 8 Ivies plus Chicago and Stanford and Duke and MIT. All right, and some of the rationale, UT said, our kids without test scores, they're not doing as well. And that's why UT Austin is now test required. And then over at Emory, John Ladding, he's the director of admissions, he said, we don't trust GPA like we used to. These grades are inflated, not tied to actual ability and performance. They're looking at other assessments, such as SATs, ACTs, and AP exam scores to give them a better grounding in what kids actually know, because so many kids are coming here with their 3.9 and 4.0 GPAs. It's less helpful for Emory and other schools when it's becoming more of a normal grade and more of an average grade is A and an A. Not so special. So we know that testing influences admissions meaningfully. And again, there are 1,900 colleges that are test optional, but many of them testing is optional, though quite impactful. And they could add, strength and confirm that GPA. And especially for certain schools and certain majors, like with STEM applicants, with that math score really makes a difference. That's where testing is even more important. Getting a sense of who actually knows what. Strong test scores can impact merit-based aid. There are schools, I'll always reference Alabama. They've been insanely generous over the past decade. It's one of the reasons their freshman profile has changed so dramatically, because they're keeping all these great students, and they're, half the kids are from out of state, and they're, it's not what you think. Alabama's really changed, and they're pulling kids down with their strong testing. You get a 32 on the ACT, and tuition drops from $34,000 a year down to $6,000. And that's very, very compelling. And they're pulling kids who, some of them are getting into Ivies, where they're looking at, tuition of 80 grand a year versus $6. That's a big difference. That's $300,000. And so merit-based aid is one of the reasons why so many students are staying either closer to home, or also going to schools like Alabama in lieu of schools that are much more expensive with their tuition. All right, so should I still prioritize testing even though schools are optional? And optional does not mean irrelevant. It can still have a very meaningful impact. Many things that are important and impactful are optional in the admissions process. And we know that for a quick minute after the pandemic, some of these colleges who were very selective began revealing their hands and showing that kids who send test scores have an advantage. Then they locked this down. We're not getting new data for the past 3 years. And so all these scores, these schools are now more selective than they were back then. But we're seeing that Boston College was admitting kids almost 2-3 to 1. Yale 3 to 1, Colgate 2 to 1, Notre Dame, Emory 2 to 1, UVA almost 2 to 1, Wesley. So, but then other schools like Vandy did not give a 2 to 1. The advantage was only slight. It was a 6% admit rate without test scores and 7% with. So that was a very slight difference. And now Vandy's down in 3% admission rate. It's insane. But again, so there are differences, but this is not broadcast, and no one knows about this. But we have the sense that schools that were very selective, many of them gave a pretty clear advantage to kids with test scores. One of the reasons why even kids without, for optional schools, if they have scores that are competitive, they send them because it makes a difference. Some schools like Grinnell and BC, they're saying, hey, if you have scores, we encourage you. They don't require them, but they admit kids at a much higher rate with test scores at Boston College. Tufts is being very transparent that if you have a 1300 or a 28, please send them. Even though their middle 50% average is much higher than that, they say we still want to see the score because we know that if you get a 1320, you didn't get a 1050. And then they've run their institutional data and they've run their regression analysis to figure out that a score of 1300 does predict performance on tests at Tufts. So even though our average may be a 1390 or 1450, if you have a 1310, please send it because we know that it actually gives us information. And then kids without test scores were lacking that information. So I think it's pretty cool to give that level of transparency to parents and families. They're pretty unusual to do that. Auburn, they're on this pivoting cycle where for this year, if you have a 3.6, you could send your application without testing. But after that, by the fall, next fall, everyone has to send test scores. And what's pretty wild, they were pretty clear that for this class, we're only going to admit about 5% of kids without test scores, into the pool. So Auburn clearly likes testing, and they're going back test required. And they were optional for 5 years, but they're making a pretty aggressive move. Same thing as a school like Caltech. Caltech was test blind, then they went test required. And so we're seeing these kind of moves, kind of shifts in the past few years. So more kids are sending test scores, but they're doing it with strategy. The same exact test score, I get a 1390. That'll help me at these three schools, and that'll hurt me at this school. So I'm going to send it here and withhold it here. It's very common, and we're going to see more of that over time. And we are seeing these rates of test submission, they keep rising every year, and the rates of non-submission, they're now falling. So the word is out. Kids now understand, and for the first time, we're seeing the flip, where in the pandemic, there were more kids not sending test scores, but now we have reversed that. We have an 11% jump. So now we have 740,000 kids with a Common App who have test scores, and 660 without test scores. And that number is going to keep growing and rising, especially as the schools who are test required, many of them are, have a big applicant pool. UT Austin, that's 48,000 kids. Ohio State, these are big applicant pools of kids. And so, as more and more schools go test required, this number will keep rising. Yep. Now, testing matters more for certain kids. If you're an engineer, that math score matters. Business major, there's finance, and that's calculus and derivatives. That math score matters. A lot of STEM kids in general. And so it helps them just level set. Are you ready for the school? That's why so many engineering programs, MIT, Caltech, Carnegie Mellon, they're test required. They need that math score to validate your abilities. I wrote an article about a year ago about that. If you don't get our newsletter, please do. There's some good content coming out. I'm writing a couple more articles for next month. But engineering programs, you see that MIT, Georgia Tech, Purdue, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, so many of these schools are now test required, and I'm waiting for A&M to go back. The UCs may be a lag. They're test blind currently, but I can see a world soon where they go back test optional. Because of recent research, there are a lot of more kids going to the UCs who are remedial in math because they may have the grades, but they don't have the skills. And that would have shown up more clearly when there were test scores. So testing has more weight at schools that are very selective. That includes the private schools and the public flagships with really with high admit rates for kids, with very competitive admit rates for kids out of state. And so waiting on schools I mentioned like UNC Chapel Hill, UVA, and so forth. All right, that's the high level. That's the background. Now I'll do a deeper dive into the actual assessments. The SAT and the ACT are now short, 2 hours and 5 minutes without science, 2 hours and 14 minutes for the SAT. So these used to be the SAT with the essay was a 5-hour test. Now it's so short, it's lovely. Great for kids, better for everyone having a shorter test. And there's been massive changes. We are still using a relatively old concordance table. It's a few years old, and they're going to update it next year because now we have a digital SAT. It used to be paper, and now we have a shortened ACT. We'll talk about that. The SAT is a computer adaptive test where everyone takes a similar baseline module with a mixing of easy, medium, hard questions. If I get about a third wrong, I'm going to the easy module. If I get fewer than a third wrong, I'm going to the hard module, both for verbal and for math. The ACT, it's just paper-based. It's a linear test. Nothing adapts, nothing changes. Here's reading, boom, here's English, here's math, and then science if you want to take science. All right, science is optional. Roughly 2/3 of our kids are doing a science. A third of them are essentially ignoring it. We still believe that everyone right now should go and spend $10 and get a science test on, a science section on one of your ACTs, because sometimes schools may flip, we don't know, and it's only $10, so why not? But a third of our students are essentially ignoring it. They're getting a score in case it's required, but they're not putting in any prep because it's optional. And schools, only a small number of schools, about Pomona, Boston University, a small number of schools care about science. Right now, the military academies. Otherwise, though, don't sweat it. ACT, it is still a speedier test. The SAT allows about 43% more time per question on math and a third more time on verbal. So you still, that has been a change. And the ACT has more testing items than the SAT. The SAT is so efficient because it's digital adaptive. They don't have to, because kids who are, at a high level with the adaptive module, they're not going to ask them a bunch of easy questions. And kids who are on a lower level, they're not going to ask them all the hard questions. So it's when you're adaptive, you can get the job done with fewer items. That is a fact. All right. The SAT has 98 items total. 8 are experimental. And there are 2 unmarked items per section, versus the ACT has quite a bit more. 29 of the items on the ACT are experimental versus 8. That's just, because they do whole passages that are experimental, not individual items. All right. The paper ACT we prefer to the digital ACT. That's Pearson's Test Nav. We aren't as big fans. Students can finally bring their own device, which is great. They can bring their laptops, their MacBooks. That's a nice win. It wasn't always that way. There are some challenges. We don't love Pearson's Test Nav. Your highlights disappear after every question for a 10 item passage, which is not smart. Long form reading is a little more challenging. You have to sometimes find and scroll and find where they want you to go. It's not automatic. And on the SAT, the College Board has the Blue Book app, very straightforward. One little passage, sometimes it's 6 lines of text, one question, next one. So there's less of a demand on the working memory, and things I don't know are smarter and better. The Desmos calculator has been a staple of the digital ACT for a couple of years, and the ACT is finally doing it too. So it's been on the SAT, but now all students can use Desmos, and that's a win. That's one real advantage. It's a great calculator. Many students are still struggling to finish the sections on the ACT. We see that they went from the old form to the new one this year, and so math, a lot of kids are still struggling to finish math, but now we see more kids are finishing the reading and more kids are finishing the science section, which is a nice thing given the extra time that they're giving kids. But science, when it comes to speed, the ACT is still a relatively speedier test. You have to work faster. That's just part of the nature of the ACT test. All right, so ACT science, it's mostly reading and math, and removing the science section really won't affect most kids. And most schools are not taking the science that seriously. If you look very closely at the averages, the average test, English, math, and reading, the composite with science and without science, the variance, it varies by 0.2, 0.1 point. It's almost nothing. So when colleges get rid of science, it doesn't really change the composites that they're seeing because science correlates so well with math and with reading skills. Boston University, Georgetown, Pomona, they want that science. They require it. Duke and Michigan recommend it. Hopkins says it can help. That's about it. So really very, very few schools are putting emphasis on science. So we don't sweat it that much, honestly. Science does not impact your composite. It's totally optional. And what matters to composite is your math score. English and reading, science is just like a separate thing. That's one of the reasons why it's not as important. It's not tied to the score. Vandy's interesting. They have a do no harm policy that the super score will include science if it helps you, and they will ignore it if it doesn't help you. All right, this is probably the last time I'll do this slide. The old and new ACTs, now it's all the new, but a number of schools, there were about 8 schools, so they wouldn't super score. Harvard, UC Austin, Michigan State, a few others. But then a bunch did, and then several thousand schools didn't have a policy at all. So ultimately, most of you, unless you took an old ACT before September, this is going to be irrelevant soon within a few months. All right, more comparison. The overlap is about 80% in terms of content, in terms of what they're measuring, in terms of reading skills, grammar, mechanics, and most math skills. There are some differences in terms of the reading level. The SAT has more more rigorous reading. The level of reading is that of an 11th grade reading level. They'll throw some Shakespeare at you. They may throw, a little poem by William Blake, or, they'll throw things you might find on an AP Lit exam. They're going to see some more advanced. You might see Milton. You might see some of the classics. The ACT, the level of reading is 9th grade. So you're not going to have the same level of difficulty on the reading. However, on the SAT, the math, you have more of these multi-step 4-part problems where you have to do several rounds of thinking and logic. Although the content is pretty narrow, it's mostly algebra 2. But on the ACT, you have longer reading, passages that are 10 items, easier but longer, and you're going to have more math and more math concepts. So it's a much broader range of math material, though not as complex. So there's more of it, much broader. The SAT is deeper, and there's more challenging math problems individually. So the name of the game, most kids, more than half the kids, they score comparably, and you got to figure out which test you prefer simply. That's one of the keys. And so SAT, a lot of kids, they're going to slow down. They're going to have a little more time, more deep concentration. The reading questions, there's more evidence, more causal reasoning, more inferences. And then, they've taken advanced algebra. A lot of the ST is algebra compared to the ACT, it's only 40%. So there's a lot more algebra on the SAT. On the ACT, it's speedy, got to move fast. You have a lot less time per question. And then also there's more working memory with these longer passages. And you also have to have memorized certain rules for stats and trigonometry. And there's less of that for the SAT. And also the ACT, you still have the option to do a paper and pencil, which we like. All right, and then here's again some of the quick information. There's more algebra on this SAT, there's more geometry and trig on the ACT. They both have data analysis and so forth. All right, now a deeper dive into the sections, talk about Desmos, the math for the SAT. The second module is going to feel very different because the easy and hard modules look very different. You're going to have a lot more easy items on the easy adaptive module and a lot more hard items on the harder one. And kids just know, this one feels different. You're jumping in with, a lot more hard items. You can definitely feel the difference. Okay. Now, you have to be thoughtful and careful on the SAT about not moving so quickly and make careless mistakes, because we found that careless errors are penalized more heavily on the SAT. Every item counts differently. Now, there's something called differential item weighting. On the ACT, every question is one raw point, one scale point. But we found that, for example, on the Blue Book test on the SAT, if you missed question number 25 on module 2, that's all you missed, you drop 20 points and you get a 780. However, if you're on module 2 and you miss question 23, which is a much easier question, you drop 50 points because that's kind of a basic concept. And if you miss that one, they're going to assume you're going to miss a lot of other simple concepts. So you don't want to miss the easy questions. So you don't want to rush and make careless errors. They're more expensive on the SAT than on the ACT. All right. When you're doing the SAT, you got to practice Desmos because there's always, we're trying to solve for the value of X. I could do some manipulations. I could isolate. I could eliminate the Y's and solve for X. This is all the steps involved. There are 9 steps to get there. But then that's elimination method, or I could do a method of substitution. I could solve for what X is and sub it out, or I simply plug that in to Desmos and instantly it gives me the intersection, the X value is 10. So again, I save all of these steps when I use Desmos. So Desmos is a phenomenal tool. And if you're prepping for the SAT, especially, you have to learn how to use it because it really is. And most kids, half the kids in the US use it for physics or chemistry. It's really a standard for graphing calculators in America. Really great. Punch it in and there's X. Use Desmos, short and sweet. All right, and especially how algebra, equations, and graphs relate and go together. You also, for the SAT, have to develop your algebra skills. There's a lot of algebra. It really is a very deep algebra test, linear functions, understanding how things work, like, positive, negative rules, all these things. Now, the verbal passages, they're short, 150 words is the max. And, there's one comparison, but otherwise it's very, very brief. On the ACT, it could be 700 words for a passage, a lot longer, more content. The SAT goes like this. Every single time it goes from easy to hard. You have your craft and structure questions, then you have your evidence inference questions, and then you go to grammar, briefly, boundaries, form, structure, and sense, the English conventions. And then at the end, it's more of a reading skill, transitions. They really reduce the amount of grammar and the amount of, so it's reading and writing, but it's a lot more reading. So whereas on the ACT, you have a separate reading section, a separate English section for the grammar, and they count equally. Here, they smash them together, and the grammar is much less, and the reading is bigger for the verbal on the SAT. Here, it's kind of showing you how this works. You're going to read the question. I'm sorry. And then kind of, this is a sample question, looking for which word, belligerent, benign, deleterious. So there are some more challenging vocabulary words, but I wouldn't have a kid prep vocabulary because it's only a few hard vocab words per test, very different than the old SAT. Okay. And then there are logic-based errors. Again, they give you a passage, which completes the text, so confirms. And it's a couple sentences. This is the SAT. All right, on the SAT, your score feedback is really, really minimal. They stop giving you missed number 17, you missed number 18. All they give you is this heat map, which isn't that useful, which is one of the reasons we like using our practice tests, because we know exactly what a kid missed, why a kid missed, and so forth. But that feedback is now gone from the SAT. And one of the reasons is because they don't tell you how many you missed, because again, one kid missed 4 and got a higher score than the kid who missed 8. Or I'm sorry, the kid who missed 8 has a higher score than the kid who missed 4, because it's all about which ones you missed, and it's confusing to families. So they're not giving you that detail anymore. All right, and we have 4 really strong practice tests that we give with great feedback to our students. Very helpful. We tell you how many you got correct, what'd you miss, why'd you miss it, how hard was the question, and so forth. So pretty robust, pretty rich feedback we're giving our kids versus what the College Board gives. All right. So again, we have 8 strong, calibrated, free tests from the College Board in the Blue Book app. And then we have Desmos, so we can learn on that. That's how you prep for the SAT. All right, ACT, key strategies for the ACT. A lot more advanced math. I mentioned they have matrices, conic sections, asymptotes. All these concepts never appear on the SAT. So it's simply broader and there's more advanced content. Okay. And you have to, learn some of the quirks. So if you're doing it online, let's say for your school, you have to learn some of the content. You have this little tool thing here with answer eliminators, answer masking, calculator, highlighter, all these little tools. And you also, with the ACT, it needs constant good Wi-Fi. That's one little hitch with the test nav, whereas for the SAT, you only need Wi-Fi at the very beginning for a few seconds, at the very end. Otherwise, you're running it off your own device, which is a smarter design, I think. On the AC, you have to move quick and avoid careless mistakes, but you have less time. And so, rise over run, pretty basic slope questions, geometry. And then when it comes to the passages, we have 94 lines of text. You read the whole thing first and then go to the 9 questions. That's the strategy. And you have to, we also like using, because you have to hold so much more working memory, we like doing underlining and starring and circling. One of the reasons we like paper. Because again, on the ACT online, if you make highlights, they get erased after each question, which is ridiculous. That's a mistake. All right. And you have to practice on the grammar, common error types for the English, a lot of comma usage, parallel structure, all these things. And then terms. So they're going to ask you, what's a determinant? You have to memorize that in terms of cross multiplication and all these things. So you have to memorize more things for the ACT. All right. Now, when it comes to which test, colleges couldn't care less. Whether you take the ACT or the SAT, all they care about is do you have the right percentile, the high enough score. And so we recommend everyone do a baseline of the SAT, of the ACT. If you're better by more than 70 points on one or the other, go with that one on the scale of the SAT, because each test has around 30 points in terms of the standard error measurement of error, if I guess right or wrong. But if I add up all the error and then you're beyond that, then you are simply better on that test. I could give it to you 5 times and you'll keep doing better on that test you were better on it. It's beyond chance at this point. Versus if I get a 1200 on the SAT, and I get a 27 on the ACT, on a given day that could flip. If I miss a few here, I get a few right there. But if I'm a 1200 on the SAT and I get a 29, I am simply better on the ACT. That's my test. Go with that test. But if you're within that margin of error, then you go with your preference, which one felt better for you. All right. Now consider the data. Taking full tests is very quick. Look for that. Concord the table link. Talk about your experience if you're in the middle, and focus on one test at a time. The testing plan is very simple. We advocate students, once they choose their lane, I'm going to the SAT or ACT, I'm going to take 3 tests. Some kids are 1 and done, some are 2 and done, but I want my plan to have 3 tests in it. Because there's also super scoring. Well, they'll give you credit for your best sectional scores, like on the March test and the May test and the October test. I'll get, whatever I'm best at in each test becomes my super score. Very helpful. We have now added a September. Before there were no summer tests and even very few fall tests. We've added so many, it's really great. So we have in August, September, October, November, December SAT, and we have September, October, December, February, April, June, and July ACT. So we have 7 and 8. So there's lots of tests during the year. Very different. That used to be 3 and 4, and things have really shifted. All right, you can prep anytime that makes sense for you. A lot of our high-flying kids with crazy hard schedules as juniors do their prep over the summer, because they do the big lift over the summer, and then they fine-tune for the test. Let's say they take an official test. It could be in December or it could be in March, but they do a big lift over the summer. Very common. But some kids wait until they finish junior year and they pack in their tests, because now, like you could do a June, July, and September ACT and still be ready for those early deadlines in October and November. You want to have your best test scores ready for those deadlines, because you want to have your best shot when you apply early action, early decision to your top schools. All right, things that work, things that help make prep more effective. Practice testing, fundamental. When you spread things out versus cramming it, kids do better. Kids who start earlier tend to do better, and kids who put more time on task tend to do better. And having a goal is helpful and beneficial. Super scoring, I mentioned that before. If I get my top score in June on verbal, my top score in math in March, that's the score they're going to use in committee when they're looking at my application. It's called super scoring, very helpful. And the ACT automatically super scores, and they're going to send the score in instantaneously. Science is not part of that. I mentioned that before. And then there's the question of, do I send my score? Do I withhold my score? So get your baseline tests in. And part of it is, there are some kids whose grades are so stellar and their academic rigor is so strong and their testing is nowhere near it. And for those kids, it's like, you know what? It's probably better for you to build a list of schools that are all test optional and go with the merits of your academic rigor and your GPA. Maybe try to prep some for a good AP score if your testing is just not going to help, because you never send a test score that's going to hurt you. And some kids, they have, again, the 4.0 unweighted, flawless GPA, all A's, 10 APs, but their testing is so low for this, and they're so below profile that I tell those kids, it's not even, I wouldn't prep. I would just go write a great essay, activities, just, make your summers count. But, if you have a 23 in HT and a competitive score is like a 34, it's just too big of a lift. In that case, I would just say go optional. But some kids want to go to Georgia or other places, or they want to go to Texas or Florida and tests are required, then you have to prep, because that's just the nature. But for the optional schools, some kids can build a good list of the 1,900 schools that are optional and get into great schools without test scores. Because my niece is graduating from Columbia, University of South Carolina, in a couple weeks. And she got a 1390. And Tulane said, we don't want your 1390. If you have below a 1420, don't send it. And she didn't, and she got into Tulane with money. Then she also, with her test score helped her at Columbia, it helped her at Georgia. But it's a balance point. With the same score, 1390 will help you here and hurt you there. So it's knowing when to send it, when to withhold it. Very important. Rick Clark, buddy, friend, colleague, if you're in that 50 percentile, you want to send it. But if you're in the bottom quartile of students, typically you wouldn't send it unless there's something special. You're applying from a region of the U.S. that gets very few applicants to that school, or you're in a depressed region where you scored a 1150, but you have the best test score in your school, and that even if they want a 1300, there could be a place where you submit that, write about your experience, and so forth, and you get credit for that if you're in the bottom quartile. Here's an example of that. So Colorado, the Buffs, their middle 50 is an 1180 to a 1390. Okay, so if I score the top quartile, of course I'm going to say that's a great score. It strengthens my application. If I'm in the second part of that quartile, I have a 1300. Still a good score. If I'm in the bottom quartile, if I'm at 1150, it's not going to help. If I have good grades and good academic rigor, I wouldn't send my 1150 unless there's something so compelling about, the average score in my school is at 1,000 and I'm the best student in the school. But that's, pretty rare. Then the third quartile, there is a little bit of nuance in that third quartile. And part of it has to do with, all right, if my grades are exceptional, my rigor is so strong, everything's really robust, then I have an 1180. It's like, you're still on the cusp of the bottom quartile. I might withhold that at 1180. However, if I have a 1290, it's much closer to the midpoint. Or let's say I'm applying to be an engineer and I have a 720 on my math, but then I only have, a 550 on verbal. I'm that third quartile, but I want them to see my 720 because I want to be an engineer. That 720 means more to my engineering, fit to major than the verbal. Because my major requires advanced math. I want to show off my advanced math, even though my verbal is weaker. And that's part of the calculus too that you would use. All right, so that's my slide deck. And we're going to go through. So I want to open up the Q&A. We have a pretty good audience here. I do want to let you know that we have 2 webinars coming up next week. I'm going to be part of one of them. We are going to be talking about the admission results from this year. We now know who got in. We now know which kids were accepted to what schools. We're looking at hundreds and hundreds of students. And that's with Bob Carlton, Lisa Carlton, and Amanda Applerouth. Looking at all the trends we've seen with fit to major, with what majors are getting in, which kids are getting in with what kind of profiles. That's going to be on May 4th. That's a Tuesday, I believe. And then Thursday, we're talking with 4 admissions directors, admissions officers from George Washington, from UGA, Wisconsin, and Syracuse, asking them what matters for them, talking about demonstrated interest, talking about what majors, testing, talking about AI, all these fun things. So if you want, and again, you don't have to be there in person. You can actually go ahead and sign up for the recordings, and then they'll mail them to you. You can watch them in 2 weeks, watch them in 3 weeks. But there should be some good content coming, and we probably have over 1,000 folks, for all these admissions directors. I think we have a pretty big audience too for this first one of analyzing the results from this year. All right, so then the next slide is going to be my last of the deck, and then I'll go to Q&A. And before we go there, the final question, the final poll, is going to be talking about testing and academics and everything else. Is there anything, do you want any help? Do you want any feedback or follow-ups from us? We're always happy to reach out to you if you have any requests and so forth. So now I want to open things up and field questions. So there should be a Q&A window. And I'm going to go ahead and pull it up. And I'd like you, okay, here we go. We have our very first, we have two questions. All right, so let me close this out. I'm going to stop sharing. All right. And please fill in your questions. I'd love to have a chance to answer questions. The first one, why do I advocate and recommend the paper ACT? And it has to do with the Pearson's Test Nav. The application itself, the software is not, the user experience is relatively weak. The College Board, they developed a brand new test that's designed for online, designed for digital testing, where they changed the number of questions, they changed the kind of questions. They went from having a massive passage to a small passage. They really made it easier and much more accessible. So versus the Pearson's, what they did, they took the same old test they've always had for 50 years, and they crammed it into like a PDF digital format. And so it's harder to use with the reading, and there's the follow-up poll. If you want any help, we do all kind of work, all kind of coaching. If there any support that you want from us, we're happy to reach out to you. Okay, and so if you have the choice, take the paper ACT. It's easier to manipulate the graphs in the science section. If you're taking science, it's easier to go through the reading and mark it up, and you have durable highlights versus like the disappearing highlights. And we just prefer it. So if, there's no advantage to take it with it on a computer. For the SAT, you have no choice. It's computer or nothing. But if given the choice on the ACT, I would do paper if that option was available in my marketplace. Okay. All right. Next question. Is there a writing portion on the ACT? There is, in fact, a writing portion, but that's typically for international students. And if you're at a state where they buy a test for every kid, like there are certain states where it's mandated. Every single, high school junior is going to take an ACT with writing. It's more of a measure of the performance of the schools, of school districts, and of the state, not so much for college admissions. And also more for kids who don't speak English as a first language. And other things that, I wouldn't, after the SAT dropped their essay, colleges stopped really using it in the same way because, 2 million kids are taking SAT and there's no essay component. So they can't compare it really apples to apples. And so college admissions officers aren't really using the essay in that way. So I wouldn't sweat it, wouldn't worry about it. It's not a meaningful factor. All right, here we go. For the ACT, the Desmos is a big deal, yes. Over half the items you can solve on the math with Desmos. Do you just bring your own calculator for the ACT? Well, for the paper version, absolutely, and for the digital. And here's the thing. I still recommend that kids bring their own calculator if they have a TI-80, whatever number they're up to, because Desmos is amazing at graphing. But if I'm trying to find a mean, like find the average or median, there are certain things where the TI is better. Desmos is incredible for graphing, very helpful for a lot of algebra, but certain problems you can do a little faster with your own TI. So I bring both anyways. For the ACT, bring your own too, for the paper and for the digital version. So Desmos, love it for graphing, but still I prefer the TI for a few other functions. We can talk about that. That's like deeper detail once you're in session. All right. Next up, and thanks for keep them coming. We have till 9 o'clock. I would love to answer the questions. Is Desmos available for the ACT? Yes, Desmos is now rolled out for the SAT and the ACT. All right. Next question. As international students based outside the US, Australia, New Zealand, we don't experience grade inflation. Good for you. There's accountability and integrity. I love integrity. But because the SAT test seats are scarce here, and they often are conflicting with school commitments given our entirely different academic calendar, if you have a strong academic record but no 4.0 GPA equivalent, do you feel they are safer going test optional rather than submitting a score sub 1300? Particularly with limited test access, may have prevented multiple attempts. But I understand that for many selective schools, non-submission won't be a choice, but for those where it remains optional, does the absence of grade inflation actually make the test optional path make more sense for international applicants? Interesting dynamic there. I mean, part of it is, they read in the context of the application. If they understand that grade inflation is on a runaway train in the US, but, like I remember when I went to college the semester in France, and I was at the Sciences Politiques. I remember that I got an 11 out of 20. And like the best grade in the class was a 17 out of 20. And it's like, then they curved it for Penn for my college, but the grading culture was just so different. In other countries, they have very different grade cultures. And I think the admissions officers understand that when they're reading from Canada, they're reading from New Zealand, because they're recruiting. They have recruiters are going to be on the admissions office are going to be reading apps from different regions of the world where they have more nuance. So they'll probably give you credit for that, understanding you're not in the same rat race we're in, where grades are they're unbalanced. But if you can, that being said, they may not have a strong record from your high school or your district. And so the more information they have that's standardized, it's helpful. So if you could achieve and also, they understand that you have a different system, testing is not as widely available. If you have a score that's close, that if you can get in that middle 50 and you're an international applicant, I would still say submit it if you can. Again, this may be a question where you ping the school admissions officer. They may have different philosophies from school to school. But if you can get a relatively competitive score, it's standardized, it gives them more information, it puts you in context with other applicants, whereas maybe your grades are going to be below. maybe you have a 3.4 because there's more integrity in New Zealand. But if I get a decent test score, okay, that kind of puts you in context of other students in the country. So I still think standardized measures are helpful when you're coming from a school where there's not much information for, unless you're at a feeder school, so I'm an international school and tons of kids apply to these schools. But whenever there's less information, I want to give them more that they actually know how to use in context. Okay. All right. When should a student begin studying for the STST if your student is a rising 10th grader? Honestly, for the overwhelming majority of our kids, I say wait until you finish sophomore year. There are some students who are super advanced, high flyers in reading and math, onto very advanced other math. I say wait till the end of sophomore year at the earliest. But a lot of our kids finish their AP exams in May. They finish then you could start, start over the summertime, totally fine. Because again, you're covering the reading level on the ST is an 11th year reading level. And the math concepts for the ACT, it's some pre-cal, some advanced math in there. So there is a reason why you don't take it as a 9th grader, because you're getting exposure to harder content, harder reading. And I don't see that much of an advantage. But again, some of our top flyers do take it late sophomore year, and often they score very well if they're super advanced in both math and in reading. Okay. All right, Cali kids. Yes, California kids. Their teachers say that there's no need, oh gosh, to take the ACT or ST. So they haven't taken it. Well, that's bad news if they want to go anywhere except for California. Do you see this changing as more colleges? That's just bad advice. If you're looking at 7 of the 8 Ivies, I mean, of the top 20 schools in the country, 12 are test required. So, I mean, you're going to be limiting yourself. So if a teacher says, then Stanford's off, Caltech is off, Claremont McKenna is now off, like you're reducing. Maybe if you're a lower level student, that makes sense. But the schools that are really selective, if you're a high flyer, if you're going for a great school, take the SAT. Not for UC Berkeley or UC Davis, but I'm assuming unless that's where you're going. If you're going to the UCs or you're going to the Cal State system, then yeah, it's not they're test blind. But my gosh, it's just like a lot of kids want to explore. They want to go to other schools, and testing can be very impactful at schools where it's optional and is required at about 40 schools, actually more than that. Any of the schools in Florida, the schools in all the flagships in the South, if you want to come here, and these are very popular schools, or the top schools in the Northeast. They're if I want to go to MIT, test scores. All right, I just listened to a podcast where they stated that according to recent student reports, College Board has once again changed the SAT and is now producing more questions that aren't solvable with Desmos. Okay, that's interesting. I am wondering if you've heard the same thing from your students. I understand that Desmos is best for graphing, but are there less graphing questions now and more questions that are best solved with a regular calculator? Well, I mean, Desmos, again, can do the primary functions. I just find it's a little faster typing on certain things. I mean, Desmos is a great calculator, for many things. But anything that has to do with graphing or plotting or exponents, Desmos. It really is ideal. But you know what? I'm going to copy this question, and I'm going to ping our head of curriculum development, because to my understanding, I haven't heard that, but I'm going to find out. Desmos, thank you for that tip. But still, even if Desmos you can solve every math problem with Desmos. You're a slight speed advantage using your TI. But I don't know. I'm going to find that out. And thank you for that question. That'd be new to me, because I haven't taken ST in quite a while myself. I really rely upon our curriculum team. They go and take it all the time. All right. My student took a practice test with Applerouth. The practice test you administer correlated with actual? Absolutely. We have a team of 10. We have, experts. Richard's been doing this for like 15, 16 years. Joshua White. We have total pros who could be writing these tests for the College Board with the amount of analysis they've done over the years, analyzing hundreds and hundreds of tests over the years. In ours, we go to incredible lengths. And many of our tests are even better correlated than the ones on the first 3 Blue Book tests, because we're tracking, we're sending people in there to take these tests to make sure that we're accurate in terms of the number of difficult questions, the spread of questions, the number of the way they're doing wrong answers, and we are studying the Blue Book test like a hawk to make sure that, we are lining it up with, we understand these tests inside and out. That's our job. So yes, ours are calibrated tremendously well with a big team of experts. All right, to improve the SAT reading and writing scores, should students focus more on reading skills or grammar? How about prepping for the PSAT reading and writing? So there is more reading than writing. When they combine them, it's roughly 2/3 reading skills with transitions and rhetorical synthesis and all the inference and questions. The grammar just got shrunk, got compressed. So they smashed them together into one for reading and writing, evidence-based reading and writing, but it really is more reading. So to work on that, hit your reading. That's a bigger portion of it. And the writing, it's more narrow. You can really get a lot of easy points if you're having issues with parallel structure, with commas and usage or gerunds. In our experience, the writing and the English on the ACT, it's the easiest lift because it's simply the narrowest. There aren't that many grammar concepts they test compared to there's a broader range of reading things they could throw at you and so forth. Are the college admissions officers familiar with all the high schools? Well, there are 30,000 in the US, but they definitely know certain ones, certain feeder schools, certain regions. But they don't have applicants from every school in the country. That would be a lot. My daughter's attending a highly rigorous high school in Jersey, and it's very tough to get to 4.0. Good for that school for having integrity. And they're going to, if you come from a feeder school, a very rigorous school, they're going to have a sense because there are definitely different grading cultures. And some schools that are much, much, much easier, the kids all have 4.0s. I mean, we have some issues here in Georgia, some of our public schools where it's a bit tragic, where kids are graduating with A's and B's who can't read. That's a real thing. And I have friends who, where they're functionally illiterate and enumerate, and they're getting A's and B's, which is an absolute tragedy for so many reasons. The accounting that we've just lost these kids. But in the grand scheme of things, and the grading culture at some of these schools is very weak. But if you're from a very strong academic school, and there are some like that where they, Thomas Jefferson, TJ in Virginia, or we have the Gwinnett School of Math and Science here, very, very robust schools, and they know that everyone's not getting an A. And so if, there is nuance, especially at schools that are strong feeders. Is a 35 ACT equivalent to a 1550? I could Google that in a matter of a second, but I think it's very, very close. It might be, just type in the word concordance table and plug that in, it'll tell you right then and there. But that's ballpark, yeah, just eyeballing it without looking at the table myself. Okay. Okay. Oh, you're actually answering. Thank you. Thank you for answering some of this. All right. Other questions? We have another 7 minutes. Give me more questions. Throw them in. What do you got? What do you want to know? Things I've heard. Is this true? How do I prep for this? I like questions. It's good feedback for me. And I learned things like, for example, is there a shift from Desmos? I'm going to find out. And I might write an article about that if it's true. All right. Do you recommend taking the science on the ACT at least once? Yeah, I recommend it just in case a school decides to add it after you've done your testing, so you have a test on there. What's on it? It's a lot of reading graphs and charts and tables. It's like interpolating points, extrapolating points. It really, you're going to have like 7 passages. There's one comparison passage looking at, different positions. But it's basic, it's not really, it's of the 40 items, a handful of them, 8, 9, 10 of them are going to require a little bit of outside knowledge, but almost all the knowledge is within the reading or within the charts. They're asking you to read a chart. Can I read an axis? Can I extrapolate beyond a trend line? Can I look at something and see, okay, do I understand about measurement error? Do I understand, what is a independent variable? What's a dependent variable? Do I understand that the framing, if there's sampling error, do I understand about the importance of a sample? And, if it's small sample size, do I understand the scientific method much more so than do I understand details about biology? They may ask some very fundamental stuff, but it's not AP Bio or AP Chem or electron orbitals or really advanced stuff or chemistry or wave equations. It really is pretty fundamental. And you can get almost all of it from, except for a few outside knowledge questions, from reading the passage. So that's why it correlates so highly with reading and math, because it's a reading and math test more than a science test. But yeah, take it one time, not a big deal. And honestly, just so you have it in case one of your schools flips and says we require it. But again, like Pomona, Boston University, it's so few schools require it, a tiny handful. Should you prep for the PSAT? If and only if you are on the cusp of national merit and you scored extremely well and you were close to the national merit cut score the previous year on your sophomore PSAT. It's not a college admissions test. Colleges do not get your PSAT. It's just preparation. It's knowledge for you. You can use it as a proxy for the ST. It's under the same scale. In fact, it's at a 1520. And on the ACT, the pre-ST is at 35. But otherwise, though, it really is a score more for you than for anyone else. You don't send the scores to colleges. And if you don't get national merit, then it's irrelevant to colleges. Can you clarify again? You gave a great slide on how to determine the SAT versus the ACT. Can you clarify at what point you just choose and go with it? We live in an area where the ACT is not popular. Okay, so the way you get a dual baseline, and Applerouth will offer dual baselines. You can take them on a given weekend. It's the 70-point range. If I get on the concordance table, let's say I get a 29 ACT and a 1250 ST, okay, you're in the range of error. So I could go ahead and take it either one. I go with my preference. But if I'm beyond 70 points, if I get a 29 ACT and a 1200, well, I'm better on the ACT, and that's the one I go with, full stop. That's it. And so that really is it. Get your baseline, compare the baselines. If you're within 60 points, go with your preference. Beyond that, go with the stronger test. And some kids are just better on the ACT. A lot of them are, actually. They might not like the way math is presented with the harder math, the deeper problems. They may dislike the more advanced reading content. You never know why. And they may be speedy, so they're great on the ACT with lower level of reading and some of the more simpler math problems, though broader. So, I would say go with the strengths. Is it normal to take an ST 2 months in a row? Sure. Oh yeah, very, very, very common, even recommended. While you have momentum. Some kids do 3 in a row and then they're done. So that's great too. There's no reason to have to wait. There is a very clear testing effect where every subsequent test tend to do better. So actually, when I'm prepping students, I plan for them to go 2 in a row. That to me is best practice. So it's very common and I think best practice. As long as you're prepping and you're maintaining momentum. So I love a May and June test. Maybe throw in August, before school starts. Very common. Does a student who will pay full tuition do differently by private schools? I thought you said something about Tulane earlier. Right. Well, Tulane wants everyone to apply early. If you don't apply early decision or early action, you're pretty much shot at a Tulane. Full pay kids have an advantage at many schools. Not all schools, but they have to maintain their discount rate, make sure they hit their enrollment management goals and have enough money to cover everything. Every full pay tuition kid is offsetting a kid who's getting high scholarship, so they're trying to balance it out. Full tuition kids are subsidizing the lower income kids, so they need them. They're doing a critical role, so they are viewed differently. And there's a whole thing, like a lot of schools are focusing more on early decision because the ED kids, oftentimes they're the full pay kids. They're the ones who aren't having to shop for financial aid, and so they're building the resources, the revenue to then allocate scholarships for other kids and regular and so forth. And so, yeah, the full pay kids in many schools do have an advantage. But it depends how on the endowment. And some schools are much more tuition dependent. And so that revenue does make a difference. That box of am I applying for financial aid or not can make a difference. But it depends on the school. That is an absolute fact. It depends on the office and their philosophy and their endowments and so forth. All right, are the schools that take only one of the tests, not the other? Nope, schools don't care. There may be a tiny, tiny regional nothing school in the middle of nowhere. National institutions, the ones you're looking at, they have no preference. They don't privilege one or the other. Because again, certain marketplaces, everyone takes the ACT. In certain markets, no one takes the ACT. It depends on where you live. And part of its history, because like the ACT started in Iowa City and spread in the Midwest. And the SAT started in Princeton in New Jersey, and then over to California and in Berkeley. And so ultimately the coasts were SAT, the Midwest was ACT, but now it's all spread out. But still, certain places in the Midwest, they do a lot of ACT. Certain places on the coast, on the East and West Coast, do a lot of SAT. So, but there's no privileging or preferencing. As long as you have a test and the score is strong, that's all they care about. Okay. All right, 9 o'clock. So that was great. Thank you for the questions. I love leaving time for questions because it helps me and it helps you. And so we're going to have more webinars next week. We have two good ones: admissions trends, and then listening to four admissions directors saying here and officers saying what do they care about, what matters, what do they see. So and look for a newsletter coming out in a couple weeks. Thanks for being here. And if you want any support with any of the stuff, academics, grades, testing, come back. Oh, and thank you for the feedback. One of the best webinars. I appreciate that very much. So have a great night, everybody, and we'll look forward to the next one. All right, take care. Bye-bye.